Welcome back to Dark Academia Queen. My name is Breezy, and here we talk very much a lot topics, many Dark Academia topics. Um, Today we are going to be talking about aestheticism and other forms of Gothic genre. I recently talked about Southern Gothic, but I do want to now in Gothic fiction. And I really want to talk about like some more forms of it, but I really want also feel like I need to start with aestheticism. And basically, this is an art movement that was in the late 19th century that valued the appearance um, of literature, music, fonts, and arts over their functions. And according to aestheticism, art should be produced to the beautiful um, rather than teach a lesson. Create a parallel to perform academic style didactic purpose, a sentiment-based illustration by the slogan, "an art for art's sake," and this flourished in the 1870s and 1880s, gaining prominence in the support of noble writers such as Walter Pe- Walter Pater and Oscar Wilde. Now, this also challenged the values of mainstream Victorian culture as many as Victorians believed that literature and the art fulfilled important ethical roles. Writing The Guardian, Fiona McCarthy states that the aesthetic movement stood in stark and sometimes shocking contrast in the cases of materialism of Britain in the 19th century. It was named by the critic of Walter Hamilton in the aesthetic movement in England in 1882. So by the 1890s, decadence, a term which was and with the origins common with aestheticism, was in use across Europe. Now, where did this originate from? Well, it has roots in German Romanticism and throughout the German aesthetics. It is derived from the Greek, uh, derived from the Greek. And Alexander Barnian's aesthetics made important use of its German before Immanuel Kant incorporated it into philosophy into the critique of judgment. Kant, in turn, influenced Friedrich Schiller's aesthetic letters in 1794 and his concept of spell. Um, Now, these ideas were imported to the English-speaking world largely through efforts of Thomas Carlyle, whose Life of Frederick Schiller in 1825, um, then critical and miscellaneous essays and resorters in 1833 to 1834 introduced many advocates um, in the English language and certainly popularizing. And it also featured Ruth Roberts as well. What about aesthetic literature now? Well, the British descendant writers were influenced by Oxford Professor Pater and his essays that were published during 1867 and 68, in which it is stated that one had to live life intensely and seek beauty. His text studies in the history of the Renaissance from 1873 was very important, popular among the art-oriented young men in the late 19th century. And the writers of the descendant movement used the slogan "art for art's sake." And the origin is which is debated. Some claim that it was created by the philosopher Victor Cousin, and although Angela Leighton notes that it was first used by Benjamin Constant as early as 1804. Now, it is generally accepted to have been popularized by Theopold Gualter in France, who used the phrase to suggest that art and morality were separate. Now, these artists and writers in the aesthetic style tended to profess the arts should be provide sensational pleasure rather than convey moral and sentimental messages. As a consequence, they did not accept John Ruskin, Matthew Arnold, George MacDonald's concept of something moral or useful. Instead, they believed that art did not have any didactic purpose and it only needed to be beautiful. And the aesthetes developed a cult of beauty in which they considered the basic factor of art. Life should copy art, they asserted. And they considered nature as crude and lacking in design compared in art. And the main characteristics of the style were suggestion rather than statement, sensuality, great use of symbols, and synesthetic and aesthetic effects, and that is correspondence between words, colors, and music. Music was often used to establish mood. It still is used to establish mood. Taylor Swift has literally been a walking, running name. Like she has literally, don't get me started. I love her Torture Poets Department album. But anyway, but the predecessors of the aesthetics include John Keats, B. Shelley, and some of the pre-Raphaelites who themselves were a legacy of the Romantic spirit, and there are a few significant um continuities between the pre-Raphaelite philosophy and that of the aesthetics, and dedication to the author, idea of the art for art's sake, admiration, art, and constraint, striving for beauty, escapism through visuals and literal arts, craftsmanship that is both careful and self-conscious, mutual interest in merging arts of the media. This final idea is promoted in the poem L'Art by Theodore Gautier who's who compared the poet to the scripter, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Edwin Burne Jones are most strongly associated with aestheticism. Now, however, their approach to aestheticism did not share a creed of the art for art's sake, but rather a spirited reassertion of those principles of colors, beauty, love, cleanliness, drab, agitated, discouraged word by the mid 19th century. In Britain, the best representative was Oscar Wilde, um, Aggleton, Charles Swinburne, James McNeill Whistler, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. The writers and their style were satisfied by Gilbert and Sullivan's comic opera, Patience, and other works such as F.C. Fernand's drama The Colonel, and the comic magazines such as Punch, that was particularly works by George D. Maurier. Now, Compton Mackenzie's novel, Sinister Street, makes use of this type of phrase throughout, in which the protagonist passes as he is influenced by older descendant individuals. In the word of Evelyn Waugh, who was a young participant of Aesthetic Society at Oxford and described aesthetics mostly satirically and but also as a former participant, and some names associated with them in assemblage by Robert Byron. Now, this is also seen in art as well. Um, the best example is going to be Lady Lilith. Um, and it's also going to be seen in aesthetic decorative arts with the aesthetic brass tail by Bradley and Herbert Company. Now let's look at some Eastern influences, like ebonized furniture and wood painted. And more often, however, this is guiding. As aesthetic movement, decor was similar to corresponding writing style. It was more centrally in nature nurture themes as well. And it contrasted like with ebonized gifted furniture in the blue and white porcelain in China. In 1882, Oscar Wilde visited Canada, where he toured the town of Woodstock, Ontario, and gave a lecture there. And in the lecture, he used the principles of the aesthetic movement in decorative and applied designs. Now, how is this actually applied today? Well, In England, it became directly involved in advertising and pure soaps. Recruited English actor and socialite Little Langtry, who had painted the aesthetic artist and was also a friend of Oscar Wilde to promote their products in 1882, making her a name and the first celebrity to endorse a commercial product. Now I love this, like honestly, and I think we use it a lot today, but I really don't think we actually get like where it came from and everything. But and we like to do our research with it. But yeah. Now let's talk about Gothic film. This is personally one of my favorite forms of literature in general and movies as well. What can I say? I was that girl. I was. But a Gothic film that is based on a Gothic fiction or contains Gothic elements. So since there are various different film genres, and this includes science fiction, film noir, thriller, and comedy, they have used Gothic elements, and it's as challenging to define what is clearly as a genre. Um, and Gothic elements have been infused in the horror film genre, contributing supernatural and nightmarish elements. To create a Gothic atmosphere, filmmakers had to seek to create new camera tricks that challenges the audience's perceptions. And the Gothic films also reflected contemporary issues like a new companion to Gothic high keys and all of that. Now, here's the thing: I grew up watching horror movies, like I was immune to it. I'm immune to them. They don't scare me. Like I'm that weird person that will fall asleep to horror movies and true crime podcast. What can I say? I'm a very interesting person. So, but anyway, back to explaining Gothic film. In the Gothic in the Cambridge Companion to Gothic Fiction, Misha Kovnat says that Gothic film is not an established genre rather than contributing to Gothic images, plots, characters, and styles to the film. And these elements are often in the broader category of horror. And what is the history? I love good history, and you were very fascinated when you clicked on this episode. But now but people see like talk Gothic cinema, and they're really talking about like camp. Um, but Gothic films were a part of the early cinema, adapting Gothic fiction on screen like stage melodramas have previously done. Gothic works were influenced by those of the 19th century: Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mrs. Hyde, Dracula, and everything. But in the aftermath of World War One, um, the horrors of war paraded Gothic films, and Robert Rhimes' The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari's in 1920, though not based on Gothic texts, exhibited German expressionism that Heidi Key said transformed the American approach to Gothic cinema. And according to New Directions in the 21st Century Gothic, the Compass, the scholars consider the Gothic film Frankenstein by James Well Dracula um and by Dr. Jekyll and Hyde are fun are foundational triptych from which they took their turn back in the Gothic films forward. In Australia, the first modern Gothic film to be considered was to be a picnic at Hanging Rock was to be is Hanging Picnic at Hanging Rock. Now, what are some Gothic films you might know? Some of these you probably know, you just don't even realize. There's Dracula, Frankenstein, Rebecca. Then there's Dracula again, The Pit and the Pendulum. More recently, Rosemary's Baby, Suspiria, Near Dark, and The Orphanage. Now, what are some Gothic romance films? Well, believe it or not, there's romance in everything. So, what are some Gothic romance films? So the Gothic romance film is a Gothic film where feminine with feminine appeal. Diane Wallman wrote in Cinema Journal that Gothic films are general permitted articulation of feminine fear, anger, and distrust at the patriarchal order, and that such films during World War II and afterward will place an unusual emphasis on the affirmation of feminine perception, interpretation, and lived experience. So between 1940 and 1948, the Gothic romance film was prevalent in Hollywood, being produced by known writers and actors, and the best known films in the era were Rebecca from 1940, Suspicion in 1941, and Gaslight in 1944. Some of my favorite personal films. Um, but less well known were films like Undercurrent in 1946 and Sleep My Love in 1948. And Waldman describes these films as Gothic Rubik, as a young inexperienced woman meets a handsome older man with whom she alternately is attracted to and repelled. Um, but the Gothic romance films from the 1940s often contain the blueprint motif, meaning that the typical setting in the house of certain is either forbidden to be used not not even close to a cemetery. In the films, Forbidden Room is a metaphor for a heroine that was repressed experience in opening the room as a cathartic movement in the film. In 2015, director Gon- Guillermo del Toro released a Gothic romance film, Crimson Peak, in which films have been passed and brilliantly written by women. And for Crimson Peak, he sought to reverse the cinematic trope. In 2023, director Ann Miller published a Gothic romance novel inspired by a classic Hollywood Gothic romance film called Bluebird's Castle. Another form of Gothic film is Gothic Western. Look, guys, there are so many forms of Gothic films that I don't have enough time in one episode to cover. I do work two jobs, so let's go ahead and clarify. I also am in school full time, although I'm taking the summer off. But I also have like three other podcasts that I do, and plan on doing research. So you have to bear with me on this. But also, please hit that like button, ring that bell, and comment, please. Please also subscribe, guys. Help a girl out. But Gothic Western is a subculture artistically similar to Gothic Americana, but blends Goth and Western lifestyles that are notably visible in fashion, film, and literature. The post-war consciousness between 1940 and 1950 left it left consumers wanting less monster-related horror in favor of dark storytelling connected to reality. In other words, the monster, subject to relativism, survives the shadows of the ideal American dream. Westerns were at their peak in popularity, but with the increase of technology and modernization and social change, not without the artistic commentary, the amalgamation of these two genres, belifting this reflection, is intimate. In 1971, Johnny Cash introduced The Man in Black. Larry Vincent and horror hosts named Sinister Seymour established Knott's Halloween Hunt in 1973, one of the first Halloween-related events on a large scale, blending Gothic and Western aesthetics to the Calico ghost town and providing the first venue of growing subculture. See, that's the thing, like, aesthetic blends with everything. Like, we go now, it's like, oh, this doesn't go with the vibe or the aesthetic I'm going for. But let's really get into it deeper. Like, what is it like? And are we using it correctly? But in literature, the stereotype of the heroic cowboy gives way to a more complex anti-hero who experienced trauma or is an overwhelming personal tragedy and associated with the darker side of the weird West monsters and villainy. Um, a clear example of this is the Hawkline monster, a gothic western by Richard Berlin, in which one was to incorporate the term in the title. Um, as well. The mixture of goth and western music have been brooding into the goth motifs interwoven into a cowboy culture, while incorporating themes in the cult of superstition. Crossover elements are seen in Gothic country, but are unique to experience in the American frontier, including northern Mexico. And the music encompasses storytelling and the cultural diversity of instrumentation associated with the American frontier, and the spaghetti western sound of Ennio Morricone and the influence to the genre. Now, what we see some of this, a lot of this in film and televisions. For example, John Carpenter's is more unique quality to this genre, as the same in Western horror. In television, Penny Dreadful's season 3 is considered to be an example of Gothic Western, with vampires invading the West. I do plan on doing an episode on vampires too eventually, just later on down the road. I have so many other topics lined up I can't wait to talk to y'all about. But it's, yeah. But it's also seen in games as well, like including Dark Watch, West of the Dead, Hunt Showdown, and Evil West. And it's seen in many areas of fashion, like a mixture of Gothic and Victorian era morning attire, incorporating black and leather elements. Alright, that's it for this episode. I will see y'all next time. Y'all have a great day.